Welcome to the South Fork Sea Farmers Presents. Today's topic is the Accabonac Harbor Restoration Project. For today's panel, we have 4 people who have been literally waist deep in this project. Barley Dunn, Director of Bay Management for the town of East Hampton, owner of Shell Works, and a founding member of the South Fork Sea Farmers. Sky Tansman, student intern for the South Fork Sea Farmers and a senior at East Hampton High School. Nick Cooper, a student intern with the South Fork Sea Farmers also, and a junior at East Hampton High School. And I am your host, Bob Tiemann, a retired educator and also a member of the South Fork Sea Farmers Board. One of the first topics we're going to look at is why we chose Accabonac Harbor as the site for this restoration program. Those of you who live here locally, I'm sure you've been to Accabonac Harbor. It is an incredibly pristine site. The Audubon Society has cited it for the waterfowl that are constantly coming through. I think we have some pictures of those. There's Accabonac Harbor at sunset. And there is during the day while we were searching for sites for our oyster reefs. And then we have just some of the waterfowl that come through there seasonally. Some fishing, and we'll get to that slide in a second. So, in order to bring Accabonac Harbor back to its more pristine origins, the Shellfish Hatchery has been seeding the harbor for how many years now, Harley?
Since the early 90s, so 30 years.
30 years.
30 years, I guess, yeah.
So why did we start seeding, and what does that do for the harbor?
Thumbnail version is, way back when the East End was just loaded with shellfish, and it was and still is part of the culture, part of the economy. And then the brown tide came through in the mid-'80s and kind of set everything way back. Landings dropped to about 20% of what they were. And the eelgrass got wiped out, so a lot of the shellfish got wiped out, so the Shellfish Hatchery was established to grow the hard clam, the eastern oyster, and the bay scallop, the 3 main commercial shellfish species, and to try and repopulate the bays. We've been doing that ever since. They've been doing well. They filter the water. They provide recreation for people that want to go out and dig them and eat them. They provide some commerce for the folks that do it commercially, and so that's what we've been doing for 30 years. And I'd like to say that they'll repopulate on their own, but things aren't looking great on that front.
So that's what I'm curious about. Why won't they repopulate? If we're putting probably hundreds of thousands,
Millions each year.
Millions.
We're going to seed close to 2 million clams tomorrow alone in Napeag and Lake Montauk.
So with those kind of numbers, I'm saying to myself, how could they not start to repopulate themselves? So what's holding them back? What's
Good question. Each species, it's different. So I'll focus on oysters because that's what we're talking about. In regard to oysters, oysters need a substrate to set on. So as you can see here, this is a clump of oysters that were set on a piece of oyster shell. So in the wild, oysters need some sort of substrate to set on. They can't just drop to the sand and attach to a piece of sand. They need, the best substrate is other oyster shell. It can be rocks, it can be tires if they're in the water. So they need something to set on. But when the harbor is predominantly sandy, muddy bottom, there's really nothing for them to set on. So that's why oysters haven't really taken off. You will see oysters set on rib mussel. For those of you that know rib mussel, they're the common mussel along the banks. They're also called the banks mussel. So you'll see some oysters set on ribbed mussels. Clams there are some areas where there's what we call a natural set of clams, where clams have spawned from possibly stuff that's been seeded or from relic beds, and they are setting onto the bottom and providing nice clam beds. Scallops are a totally different story. That their habitat is really gone. And recently there's been, everybody's heard about the recent issues with the scallops, whether it's the parasite, the warming waters, or a new predator in town. So really what it comes down to is the habitat and water quality, but habitat really utmost.
Okay. Could you bring up that map now? Okay, so there's Accabonac Harbor, and we have the areas in red that are closed year-round, and the areas in blue, they're closed for basically the summer months?
Basically the summer, yeah. They're generally open from December to May.
And now Nick and Sky and I have paddled all around that entire harbor looking for places for oyster reefs, and it appears beautiful.
It's a beautiful harbor. Yeah.
But what's going on with the water that we have to close such a huge percentage of it year-round, or at least in the summer?
The closures are based on E. coli bacteria, which comes from poop, for lack of a better word, and it's not necessarily always human-derived. It can be animal-derived. Take Northwest Creek, for instance, a really entirely undeveloped harbor. That's also one of the blue areas. It's closed for part of the year, and that's mostly due to animal waste. So it really comes down to this E. coli bacteria that determines which areas are open and which areas are closed. So the red is closed year-round, like you said, higher levels of bacteria. And you can see, if you look at the maps, you can see those red areas are usually the ones that are on the the edges or the inside creeks of all these
to the
harbors and
extremities
creeks.
where the creeks are emptying in?
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
And it's based on flow. They're not getting the flow that the center of
Right.
Accabonac Harbor is getting.
So they're the furthest from the inlet.
Right.
Okay.
Or any other flow, yeah.
So what type of remediation can be done to combat the pollution? I know one of the big pushes in the area is to change the type of cesspools we use.
Yeah.
That will do something. That'll help. What else can be done?
It's in regard to E. coli, it's mostly surface runoff, and like I said, in regard to the animals, there's not much you can do.
To the wild animals.
Wild animals,
Dogs,
dogs obviously.
pets we can pick up
make sure we
after.
pick up after
Yes.
them. Septic systems are mostly targeting nitrogen, so the bacteria is not necessarily coming from the septic systems. We're more worried about nitrogen coming from septics. Flow and filter feeding shellfish are what we can use to reduce E. coli. So in saying that, I want to make sure that their minds don't directly go to, we're eating these disgusting filter feeding shellfish that have this bacteria in them. So the light blue areas on that map, or the areas that are not outlined with red and blue, are squeaky clean. Those are the areas that we can eat our shellfish out of and not fear getting sick. It's when you get into those fringe areas, the red, closed, and the blue areas that you need to be careful. But basically more flow and more filtration is what we're looking at.
So why oysters as the bivalve of choice?
Good question. Oysters are the filter feeding powerhouse. So these an adult oyster, like this is a big oyster, 4 inches, but this oyster can filter about 50 gallons of water a day. Extrapolate that out to the millions of oysters that are out there, the hundreds of thousands of oysters that were just on that reef that we just placed last week, and you've got tons of filtration, not to mention the habitat that's also being created by all the nooks and crannies on the oyster reef and in the oysters themselves.
So we've got the seeding, which is basically throwing oysters for human consumption, right? People who go and get them. You've also got the oyster gardening, which has a spot in Accabonac. How many cages are there?
There's about 30 cages there with about 1,000 oysters
1,000
each.
oysters per cage.
So do the math,
Okay.
yeah.
And now we're starting our oyster reefs. We were lucky enough to place the first oyster reef, what was it, a week ago Monday?
Monday the 19th.
Monday the 19th. You want to talk to everybody a little bit about that whole process, because you guys were essential in nurturing everything, getting ready for the reef, and then actually creating the reef and putting it together.
Sure. So as interns over the summer, Nick and I cared for the developing spout-on-shell that was located at the East Hampton Hatchery. And so we took weekly measurements of their growth using a caliber. We flipped the biodegradable bags that they're in to prevent silt accumulation so that they can grow and filter the water. And then, Nick, would you like to describe the actual construction?
Yeah, so we ended up going out to Montauk for a day, and we made a bunch of bags, and we put a bunch of just empty shell into these bags and closed them. There were about 200? 180, not quite 200. But we eventually went to Accabonac Harbor on Monday with a local club, the Environmental Awareness Club, which Sky's a part of, and we had them and 80 or so spring sixth graders.
It might have seemed like 80.
Yeah.
58.
Oh, okay.
But it does seem like 80.
Yeah. 58 spring sixth graders and the Environmental Club and us helped assemble the Oyster Reef in certain rows. So we had 50 yards of oyster bags, 3 bags each, and we piled them up. And that was basically the construction of our first oyster reef that we've done so far.
So far.
The
beginning.
Yeah.
And that, I believe you said, was the first oyster reef.
First oyster reef in East Hampton Trustee
in
Waters.
East Hampton Trustee Waters.
Yeah.
Great.
It's awesome.
So before we get into the presentation on this reef and the additional reefs, I want to explain to everybody the difference between the oysters that you seed and how that happens, because we talked about, them all sticking together like this, yet we're able to seed oysters, single oysters, throwing them out, and the habitat created by the cluster.
Yeah. So it's a very, very important distinction. So this sample here is this year's spat on shell. So to go back a little bit, spat is the word we use for juvenile shellfish. So we'll say juvenile shellfish are the ones that can't sexually mature, and oysters can sexually mature or become sexually mature at about a year. So this is what when you hear the term spat on shell, this is what it looks like. This is a bunch of oysters on a big piece of surf clam shell. And this is what it looks like another 2 or 3 years later. So this is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 adult oysters attached to one small oyster shell. Spat on shell becoming an oyster reef. So when we're creating single oysters that we seed, so what happens in the hatchery is we spawn the shellfish, and the larval stages of all three, the clam, the oyster, and the scallop, are very similar. They have a swimming larvae stage, and then at about 2 weeks, they drop to the bottom, and they go through a metamorphosis. And this is where they start to differ, but I'll talk about just oysters. So the oyster, when it sets to the bottom, it has a foot, which is basically a fleshy appendage that it uses to drag itself along the bottom and find a substrate to attach to. So in the wild, on an oyster reef, if there were an oyster reef, it would find a piece of oyster shell and cement itself to that shell. So in the hatchery, what we do is we provide this ground up shell called microculture. This is just basically ground up oyster and surf clam shell. So in the hatchery, we set these up and prepare them to set on one single piece of culture. So when you have a single oyster like this, it's set, it's cemented, but it's cemented to a tiny little piece of microscopic culture like this. So we end up with this nice single oyster. So the oysters that you find on your raw bar, in the seafood shop, or that you pick up on seeding grounds are this single oyster. So if we want to make spat on shell, instead of providing the microculture in the hatchery, we provide this big chunks of shell. So instead of setting on a single piece of shell, a whole bunch of oysters set on one clump of shell, creating this mini, what basically amounts to a miniature reef here. So you can see all these nooks and crannies, oysters on both sides. So this is sitting on the bottom. That's creating a whole bunch of habitat there. There's going to be stuff crawling in underneath to hide from predators. whether it's nursery fish or grass shrimp. And as it grows, obviously this shell is not going to retain what is probably about 30 oysters here. Some are going to outgrow and outcompete the others, and you'll end up with about 10 adult oysters on this large piece of shell. So that's in a nutshell, and it's very easy to differentiate in the wild. So a single seeded oyster is going to look just like this, a beautiful little oyster with nothing really attached to it. But like I said, sometimes you'll get oysters that attach to rib mussels or on rocks. So an oyster that's attached to a rock in Accabonac, when we actually saw one, when we were setting up the reef, there was one that was attached to a rock. That's what we call natural set. So that's a larvae that was in the harbor that sat on that rock and cemented itself. And if you'll also find oysters attached to ribbed mussel. And the way to determine whether it was attached to something is to look close to the hinge, and you can see the old marking of what it was attached to, and it might have broken off. So I might have gone off on a tangent. But hopefully that answers your question.
And the other thing is too, when we think about the reef, and whether people are going to want to take oysters to eat off that reef, you're never going to get a nice shaped oyster like this with a nice deep cup that you would get in a restaurant. The reef oysters, quite frankly, they're going to be ugly.
Yeah, and you can see it here.
And that's
These are
good.
edible, but breaking these apart from each other, they're gonna break apart, and they're a little ugly. They're not a nice half shell oyster like this.
Right, they
And
don't have
that's
that deep
that's what a
cup.
reef oyster looks like. Not pretty, but kind of
But-
pretty because they're filtering, they're providing habitat, so they're pretty in a different way. I'd say.
Their function is essential to bringing back the bay.
Yeah.
So on that note, do you guys want to talk about your upcoming presentation with the trustees of East Hampton? If we can bring that up and you can start to explain the next steps in our process for Accabonac Bay.
So the reef that we put in on Monday was really just a kickstart to what we hope to be doing within Accabonac Harbor in the coming years. Nick and I hope to put 2 more reefs in the hopes of the reefs working in combination with one another to make a nice impact.
So overall, the South Fork Sea Farmers have a mission, which is to educate and raise awareness of the importance of marine aquaculture and to inspire other local programs to do the same that we're doing and make a change in our local environment. And we, as we previously stated, we work really, really closely with the East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery, and we thank them for their location where they let us grow our spat-on shell.
So as Barley previously touched on, the reason why we cannot shellfish in all parts of Accabonac Harbor is because of the presence of E. coli and other algal blooms, which can occur partly from excess nitrogen and phosphorus from septic systems and animal feces, human feces. So with oysters, they're filter feeders, so they're able to, as they feed, they filter water through their gill chambers, taking out those pollutants, cleaning the water while sustaining themselves with food. So that's why oyster reefs are an amazing mitigation measure to fight against these algal blooms.
So Barley, you touched on it a little bit before. Oysters being filter feeders, even in the more pristine waters, they're still eating those same organisms. They're taking nitrogen out. They're eating algae. How come we can eat them? Because I have people ask me that question all the
Yeah,
time.
no, I get the same question. So, like I said, the areas that we eat them from have been certified as harvestable waters. So all those waters that, if you look at the map on the DEC website, like you said, there's the red, there's the dark blue, and there's the light blue. The light blue we can eat shellfish from year-round.
Mhm.
The dark blue we can eat shellfish from during the winter. So when we harvest from those areas, we know that the water is safe, basically safe for consumption. And this is, it's not something to fear for sure, because it's a human health issue. So it's taken very seriously and probably quite conservative.
So even though those waters are clean, the process of them eating these algae and things doesn't concentrate bad things inside.
Right.
They just filter through and use it to live as
Yeah,
energy to
yeah,
live.
and they're when we hear a lot of people call nitrogen a pollutant, but it's nitrogen is in excess. It's called a pollutant because it causes harmful algae blooms. We shouldn't think of it as a pollutant because when we as consumers hear the word pollutant, we don't want to eat it. But
Right,
there's
right.
actually absolutely no reason why we can't eat shellfish that are taken from waters that have excess nutrients. It's just more nutrients. But it's very important for us to eat them because the only way the nitrogen is actually removed is when the shellfish are removed. So they're utilizing that nitrogen for their shell and for their meats, and the only way we can remove the nitrogen from the waterway is actually removing the shellfish. So we try to always tell people to eat more shellfish.
So the shellfish remove nitrogen, and if we don't have the shellfish, nitrogen would become so concentrated that then we get those algae blooms because of the excess nitrogen.
Right. And
Okay.
the only other real thing that's utilizing nitrogen are plants, seaweeds. So back in the day, it would have been the eelgrass, right? And that's another reason why we're missing the eelgrass is because the eelgrass utilizes that nitrogen. But the nitrogen, again, back to my point, the nitrogen isn't removed unless the plant or the animal that utilizes it is removed.
Right.
So it's really effective to actually take the oyster, the clam, the scallop, if you can get them, out of the water and eat them because they'll be replaced either by nature or by restocking.
Sorry for the side to that. Back to the shop.
Okay. So, continuing on the presentation, another benefit of oyster reefs that I don't think we've really talked about yet is their ability to prevent erosion, which is a big problem for especially homeowners in Accabonac Harbor. And it's been a really great pitching point of ours when we speak to homeowners and tell them that the oyster reefs we're implementing by their homes could prevent erosion near them and potentially keep their backyard intact. So what happens is incoming waves can be reduced, their impact can be reduced, and they can be deflected by oyster reefs, which reduces the impact of waves on the shoreline and therefore reduces the erosion on the nearby land.
And that picture, if you go back one slide, please. That picture of the oyster reef butted up right against the shoreline there, which is different from the one we put in last week. That's exactly what it would look like if we were trying to preserve the shoreline, which I wish we had that picture when we were talking to some of the homeowners.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what
Just
it's going to be.
thinking about what's happening in Florida right now. I mean, that's not going to do much for a 10-foot storm surge, but for little lapping waves, that does a lot.
And in Accabonac, the shoreline it's mud.
Yeah.
It's the end of a salt flat, and it's really easy for minor wave action to just wear away at it.
Just chips away at it.
So in terms of the methodology that we've been using to create these oyster reefs, within the biodegradable bags, which are made of cellulose, so once we create the reef in 2 to 3 years, it'll be like we've never been there, and just the shells will be left behind, which is really nice. Within those bags, there's mixed generation of spat, so they're developing at different rates. And in terms of where we chose to put our reefs, we needed to find a location where the bottom of where we'd put our reef down was hard enough so that the bags themselves wouldn't sink into the ground, be covered by sand and silt, and thus suffocate the oysters. So we had to search for a hard bottom to do so.
We also took into account the community, the local community, especially schools. So previously, the oyster reef we built last week, we used the Springs Elementary School. The 6th graders there helped us build. And I know with a future reef that I'm doing, I'm hoping to get the Bridgehampton School District together. And I think Skye is getting the John Marshall Elementary School in East Hampton to help her build her oyster reef. And that's really important to us because another goal of the South Fork Sea Farmers is to educate and raise awareness. And by doing that with the future generation, we can hopefully make them environmentalists and have them have an impact on our world in a positive way.
inspiring plenty of South Fork Sea Farmer future interns, hopefully. And then the bottom of our reef, because as we said before, there are 3 rows stacked on top of one another. There's blank bags on the bottom, of course, so that the top bags with the spot on shell have a place to grow and not have sand infiltrate their hopes to do so. But there's also blank bags on the top, which will monitor for natural reef growth, which is a hopeful possibility.
And just before we move on, the community involvement there, we've been very lucky to have support from the Accabonac Protection Committee, which you guys actually did a presentation at their last meeting, which was incredibly well received. You were like celebrities when it was over. It was really cool. Next slide, please.
So for the locations we chose, again, we chose the location for the solid bottom and also the distance from the inlet, because the farther you get from the exit of Accabonac Harbor, the more polluted the area generally is. These were the areas that we chose that were most conducive to reef development, furthest towards the 3 points of the harbor. So spawn from these 3 locations in the Oyster Garden project that we're doing will produce a significant volume of larvae that could result in new natural setting on the reef.
Can we talk about that a little bit more too? The volume of larvae that need to be produced to actually get natural set, to have a reef not grow because we're putting more shell with spat on it or more oysters, but to actually grow naturally. From what I've read, is really rare. So will one reef be enough to actually have an impact on the harbor in general?
It really depends on the water flow. So like I said before, when these animals spawn, you have about a 2-week larval cycle. So during that larval cycle, the larvae are literally floating.
Right.
Floating. They're planktonic larvae, which by definition is floating larvae. So wherever they are at that 2-week stage when they're ready to set is where they're going to end up. So if you could go back to that map, actually. So it really depends on the water flow. If they spawn, say they spawn at Oyster Reef number 3, and they just, which is on the bottom of the screen there, and they kind of circulate south of the inlet, or it's actually north of the inlet, but to the bottom of the inlet for 2 weeks, and then by chance they cruise by that reef when they're ready to set, then you'll have a natural set on that reef. So the more reefs that you have, the more larvae you're going to have. And then, like I said, depending on the flow, and the other good reason to put your reefs away from the inlet is that, and you know this, Bob,
Yeah.
All of you know this, Sky, Nick, the water's coming in the inlet, it's being sucked out the inlet due to the tides. So the closer your reefs are to the inlet, the more likely the larvae are to be sucked out into the greater bay. So the farther they are from the inlet, the more likely they are to remain in the harbor. So another good point to make is that the fecundity, which is our scientific word for the number of eggs that these oysters hold, it's huge. When we do our spawns at the hatchery, we spawn 30 individuals, and we might have 10 females that spawn, and we'll have hundreds of millions of larvae. So if your reef has 100,000 oysters on it and they all spawn, and they generally do spawn at the same time, you'll have billions, probably billions of larvae in Accabonac that are going to be floating around for 2 weeks and hopefully setting on your blank shell or on your existing oysters. You know, oysters will set on live oysters, so you'll have natural set on your already existing oyster. So the more reefs you have, it's kind of like a lottery. The more reefs you have, the better chance you have of winning a natural set.
Yeah, the spawn is determined by temperature, water temperature. In nature, let's say out of 1 million larvae, how many of those survive? Because I know they're food for many species also. That's, you know.
No, it's a good question. In nature, it's single digits percentage.
Right.
So, and that's why these animals are designed to produce so many larvae.
Right. So, I mean, people here were putting out millions, they're going to think, oh, we're going to have piles of oysters
Yeah.
very quick. No,
No.
it's very rare. Maybe 2-3% that are actually going to be lucky enough to set on an oyster shell and start
survive.
to. So the more volume we can get from multiple oyster reefs, the better chance we have of actually getting a reef to start growing naturally.
But not to mention because like I said, there's really no habitat in these harbors
That's the
and
other
creeks.
big
The more
thing.
reefs you have, the more habitat you're going to have, the more filtration.
When you say
The more
habitat,
the merrier.
when you say habitat, we're talking about other species other than shellfish. What
Yeah,
other species
habitat for other
are gonna
things.
benefit from having oyster reefs in the harbor?
You're going to have crabs, the mud crabs. Unfortunately, the invasive crabs, they're going to find their way in there. Grass shrimp, all the nursery fish, blackfish, black sea bass, porgy, oyster toadfish. You'll have bait fish hanging around the reef because they have places that they can shoot into and hide. It's just, for landlubbers, just picture a desert. There's really no life there. Drop some sort of shelter into that desert and things will find their way to it because it provides a place to hide. It provides them a place to hide and survive.
Does an oyster reef kind of fill the same role that a coral reef does in tropical waters?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Any nook and cranny that you can provide will be occupied literally within days, whether it's a crab or grass shrimp or a nursery fish. And for those that have spent time in the water, you've seen it. You'll go from barren sand bottom to any bottom with substrate, and there's just a lot more life there.
Well, even the area around the oyster gardening, which
Mhm.
I've been there since the beginning of that, and when they first put the cages in, the entire bottom was just flat, barren, nothing. And now you're pretty much wading through plant life, and there's everything floating around you, biting at your legs as you're walking out there. That didn't exist before.
Yeah.
It's alive now.
So, going back to the presentation, the second reef, which is the one that I'm taking care of, is on the shoreline in front of 113 Louse Point Road. So it's on the Amagansett side of Accabonac Harbor. This site, specifically this house, has a significant erosion problem. So implementing the oyster reef could help the homeowner gain some land back and reduce further erosion on his backyard. In addition to the restorative impacts of the reef that we already discussed, this location can be placed tight to the side of the shoreline. Placement of the reef will be discussed with the homeowner, and we've been working on that. The house is currently being sold, so we have to speak to the new buyer, and it's a bit of a process, but
And we make it clear, none of this is set in stone yet. We'll be proposing these sites to the trustees, and hopefully the homeowner and the trustees will all be in favor, and if not, we'll have to go back and find another site.
yeah.
So I'll be the primary caretaker of reef number 3. I'm sure Nick and I will help each other out on our respective reefs, but they are somewhat individual. And so just with Nick's reef, similarly, erosion is a problem here, and of course we're trying to filter out the water column. So just preventing erosion and polluted waters is what we're doing. And we spoke to these homeowners, and they were very enthused and supportive of our proposed plan. So things are looking forward.
So for community support, obviously the South Fork Sea Farmers were the lead agency that's working on the coordination of this project, the fundraising, the grant writing, and the physical implementation of it. Also, the East Hampton Shellfish Hatchery, like I said earlier, they've provided us with the spat-on shell and a lot of support, and their location where we can grow the spat-on shell.
Of course, the Accabonac Protection Committee, which was a major push for us to implement these reefs. And what I think is extremely important is incorporating the local school districts just to get kids involved early on, from an early age, in environmental projects. I think it's important to take part in experiential learning, because I remember growing up that field trips are what you remember most. It's what you gain the most from. So I think it's super important that we incorporate these kids. And they're excited about it, so it's all good stuff. Of course, the Surf Radar Foundation, which is always helpful, and the Nature Conservancy as well.
What kind of feedback did you get from the sixth graders when we put the Oyster Reef in? I mean, they're sixth graders. They were all over the place, and they were overly excited, let's put it that way. But
Yeah.
some of their comments, how did they interact with you?
I'd say they were very excited, definitely rambunctious, loud, but happy to be there. And I think they were excited to be engrossed in an outdoor environment. They loved seeing all the little critters in the water. So overall, definitely a positive experience.
Yeah, I'd say the noise they made, like how loud they were, like corresponded to how excited they were. You know, whenever like a fish would go by, they'd all like squeal, and they all like enjoyed getting in the two lines and having their partner to talk to while they passed bags down to us. And you know, it was a little stressful for us a couple of times, and they were a little loud, but it was definitely, I feel good knowing that like we did something to not only help the environment, but to help kids that are growing up in our local school district.
I also think they handled the fact that we didn't expect the tide to be as high as it was.
Mhm.
Definitely.
So they were expecting to be, wading in a foot of water, and it was probably closer to 3 feet of water that they were wading in.
They were
So
up to their chest,
some of them,
waist.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Some of them just went in for a swim too. But,
Completely dumped.
Yeah, they handled that very well, I thought. So, in your experience now as an intern, you'll be moving ahead with your science research projects that are going to be tied to the work on the reef. Could you both talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So within our methods and research program at our school, it's a 3-year course. First year, start off with paper research, just getting to know your topic. Second year, you do your own experiment. I focused on the implementation of temperature and alkalinity on mussel filtration. Through that, I came to this internship, and this year, my research is focused on solely the maintenance and impact that the reef has on Accabonac Harbor. So I plan to go out there, even in the middle of winter, in a kayak and waders, and just do basic readings on solute concentrations within the water, which is just the particle concentrations within a select sample of water. As I said, temperature and alkalinity, and then I'll have a 1 meter by 1 meter space of blank shell that will hopefully, we'll see some new natural growth on there as well.
Yeah, so for me it's pretty similar. It's only my second year, it's Sky's third year, so last year I just did paper research, but this year and this past summer I was working on the Oyster Reef with Sky, and this year my main goal is really to keep working on the Oyster Reef, implement the second one, get this presentation with the town trustees, and get them on board and keep maintenance. And something I'm interested in tracking, and something I was interested when you told me about it, was the like natural reproduction of oysters when they reach that sexual maturity and they're able to make that jump to become new larvae and find a new spot to kind of attach to and start growing. And I'd really like to track that, actually.
Right. If we can get that to happen
Yeah.
on any sort of scale, it'll be quite impressive.
It would.
Yeah. I'm trying to get my train of thought. I did do that and that. What was next? I'm blanking. So talk about your intern experience in general. I know we did a different show on this, but your actual experience as an intern, how does it differ from the classroom?
I'll start off by saying that this internship experience was not what I expected to be, but in the best way possible. Nick and I have gone to fundraisers, just general presentations in front of a bunch of people. Different from the classroom in terms of I am excited about regular learning at school, but I am super excited to get out into the real world and interact with those who are older than me, I've gained definitely a lot of social skills in terms of communicating and advocating for myself and my research. So definitely the experiential side of things.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's always unexpected, but it's always unexpected in a good way. You know, when you get a job, when we eventually get a job, because we'll have to do that at some point, you don't like,
Put it off for too long.
yeah, you don't sit in a classroom and listen to someone else like teach. That's not how life works. You get out, get your hands dirty a little sometimes. I know we were sweating a little in Montauk trying to make those 180 bags of shell. And it's really a different type of learning. We're still learning, but it's hands-on, and we're definitely learning skills that you wouldn't expect to be learning in like a science internship, like even learning how to like write an email to someone, or something as small as talking to there was a lady from the East Hampton Star that we had to speak to, and just learning like certain skills like that, and publicity and that other side of things that you would never really know about if you hadn't have done this internship.
And have you kept track of how many times you got cut?
No.
People
Countless,
don't realize
yeah.
how sharp oyster shells are.
Yes.
So once we get the approval of the trustees, what are our next steps paper-wise? You know, we've still got a lot of agencies.
Then we go to the state,
Right.
which I know takes a very long time. The first reef took almost 2 years, so kudos to Bob for that, because I can imagine how frustrating it would be. But because you've gone through that process, we know what to expect. So hopefully to be a little quicker for reefs 2 and 3. My fingers are crossed for this spring, possibly, if things go our way.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would be great. And obviously we have yours as a template already. So
We've got a template.
we'll be spending a few hours in the library or in the high school library even, just printing stuff out, working on the slideshows that you've made and getting it done, because this is the part that sucks probably for most people.
Yes.
You just want to get out there and build the reef and make the change and not have to deal with all the paperwork, but that's how it works.
Well, I made a few mistakes just to illustrate what mistakes you shouldn't make along
Yeah.
the way.
Exactly.
So that's a teacher in me. So if we're able to get this in next summer or before you graduate, okay, that would be great. But what if we can't? What if the paperwork, it is a grueling process. I know this even when we spoke to people from the Billion Oyster Project who have a huge staff, it takes them 2 years to get a permit, but they're probably much bigger oyster reefs. What are you gonna do if you have to go away to college and your oyster reef isn't
I
ready
know.
yet?
It'd be so heartbreaking. I'm going to try to potentially, we could maybe build it over the summer. I don't know if that would, like, August maybe, because I'd be gone by September. But as president of the Environmental Awareness Club at my school, I'm hoping before I go that I can inspire some people who can potentially not completely take over, but definitely help me while I'm gone. And I'm sure Nick
Yeah,
will step
I'll
up
still
to the
be
plate
here.
as well.
You'll still be
I got
here.
another year, so I'll take control of whoever's new and coming in.
But
I'll
I
be the boss.
definitely don't think that, like, the internship's over, then our participation in it is over, because I know I'm very passionate about it, Nick's very passionate about it, so we're going to do everything we can to stay involved and continue making our impact.
Yeah, and personally, I hope when I go to college, I get to do a little research myself. I don't know about
Definitely.
you.
This
but
has
that-
inspired
Yeah,
wanting to partake in more internships, more research opportunities in the future.
hmm
Cool.
Now, Wally, when we look at the harbor now, and this oyster reef project, and even if we get all 3 oyster reefs in and we have the cages floating, and we get a natural growth of an oyster reef, all best case scenario,
Right.
I don't think that alone is enough to bring the harbor, to restore the harbor to its natural state. I think it's one
My
piece of a
mind-
big
My
puzzle.
mind goes to eelgrass. Without eelgrass, none of our harbors are going to be in their natural state. Now that's still missing, or some sort of seagrass, because without bottom substrate of some sort, it's going to be really hard to get the harbors back to their natural state. So hopefully the eelgrass, you know, evolves to be able to survive these warmer temperatures and works its way back in, but it hasn't happened yet. But it's going to be really hard to get back to the natural state. Plus, you know, there's so many other things, all the development and all the other hits on the water quality. But really, the more oyster reefs we have, the better, just because of that lack of habitat.
Right.
You know, like we've been talking about.
Well, I have read that there's, seems to be, and nothing definitive, but there's research on the relationship between having an oyster reef and eelgrass doing better in that area because of the increased water clarity. That would be the only obvious thing, I think. Do you think bringing up, what's the range of eelgrass? Is there eelgrass in Chesapeake Bay? Is there eelgrass in more southern waters?
Yeah, there's eelgrass. The range of eelgrass is from really the entire East Coast, but there's different varieties.
Right. So what are the dangers in bringing up a variety that exists in a warmer climate, since our waters are warmer now?
It's been tried. You know, Cornell's been working on eelgrass restoration for decades now. They tried it. It didn't work. I'm not sure. I'm not an eelgrass expert by any means. Whether it's worth trying again could very well be. Yeah, but there are other alternatives. You know, there's another invasive seaweed called codium. It's that we call it. Some people call it dead man's fingers, Sputnik grass. It's that fat spaghetti-looking weed. It's actually semi-buoyant.
Okay.
That's a nice alternative because that provides a lot of habitat. So in areas where that exists, you'll see a lot of life. Even scallops can survive. So there might be, maybe something else will work its way in.
The scallops, and that's the clearest example of where the need is that scallops need some sort of plant to hang on to during, right at the end of the larval stage?
Yeah, at the end of the larval stage, there'll be, an eighth of an inch size scallop, and where there's eelgrass or substrate, they'll actually attach up onto those blades to get up off the bottom. So that's their most vulnerable stage, because if they're just on the bottom, they're pretty thin shelled, and they're like popcorn to all the crabs out there. The harbors are loaded with crabs, and getting through the crab predation stage is the biggest crux, really, for most of these shellfish. And that's where the habitat comes in.
Is the crab population larger than it should be?
That I couldn't say definitively. Yeah,
I'm curious if
it's hard to say.
Because what are the predators for crabs?
Fish, birds.
Okay.
Yeah, there's plenty of predators for crabs.
Plenty of seagulls around, that's for sure.
Plenty of gulls, yeah.
So, I think we've pretty much explained our purpose in trying to restore Accabonac Harbor. Does anybody want to add anything to help the audience understand?
There's nothing I could think of.
Can't think of anything.
I think we've covered pretty much everything.
I think we've covered it. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your help. And that wraps up another.
Great job.
Thank
you too, by the way. Awesome.
Yeah, you guys
Really impressed.
have
Thank
been
you.
great.
Aw, thank you.